Welcome to this afternoon and to Better Statistics seminar on inflation 2022. A number of people say, well, it's very good to have that at this time. Frankly, one wishes one didn't have to have it. We briefly just say the purpose behind Better Statistics is to try to share not only statistics, but what they mean, why they exist, and how we might improve them. And I'm very, very grateful to have the set of speakers this afternoon sharing their views on inflation as we go from what may cause it through to how we measure it and finally what we might do about it. That's the gist of the day. And I start off with the keynote speaker, the first keynote speaker, is Professor Doug McWilliams, who's actually the only one of the speakers that I sort of personally know a little anyway. We first met in the 1990s, and I'm very intrigued to find out that he was a consultant to IBM at the same time as I was to IBM Europe, and we've never shared information. Hopefully we can do that later. But Doug is a very experienced man, having founded CEBR a number of years ago, a successful consultancy dealing with all matters of business information. And so I welcome Doug. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you so very much. I should say I'm an ex-professor, not a professor. And whether that increases my status or not, I'll leave it to you to decide. I'm really just a boring economist, and I'm not going to answer all the questions that I've been asked, but I'll try and answer the questions I set myself. First, why we didn't, or why the authorities at least, and I see Robert sitting over there, failed to predict the scale of inflation that's emerged. Why they failed to take action. I mean, even if they got their forecasts right, could they have done anything about it? What we think is likely to happen, and then finally I will do a little bit in trying to answer the question that was set to me, which is what does all this mean for business? Now, this is not meant to make you think that I resemble Mel Gibson, but I have spent quite a lot of the last 20 years trying to persuade the Treasury, then the OBR, and the Bank of England to pay more attention to those of us from the independent sector. Now, obviously I'm talking my book there, but you know, if you're not prepared to talk your own book, who else is going to talk it for you? I do think there is a degree of groupthink, and I do think that that has contributed to the failure to anticipate inflation. As far as the OBR is concerned, and I'd be very interested in the thoughts of those familiar with the institution, my guess is that part of the problem is that the modelling process is quite a long-winded one by the standards of most other people. Now, I know why it is a long-winded one, and it may be that it's not possible to make it anything other than a long-winded one, but it does reduce the flexibility in the system. I think the second thing is if you have a long-winded and complicated modelling process that has to produce lots and lots of outcomes, your models tend to become fairly Keynesian. Now, I'm not one of those who says that you shouldn't have Keynesian models. First of all, I think Keynes actually has a lot still to offer. But I do think that if you use Keynesian models, you should be very aware of those things that you don't include, and you should interpret them with a lot of common sense and also very recent and up-to-date factual knowledge. My sense from talking to modelers is they always start talking about theory first. And I always get slightly suspicious about people who make models work in theory but not in practice. I think the best test of a forecasting model is it good at forecasting? And I think that should be given a very high degree of attention. Looking at the various bodies, now looking more at the MPC than the others, there's a great drive for diversity, which I actually approve of. In my book, The Flat White Economy, I explained that one of the successes of the tech businesses in the East End of London was that they were immensely diverse, and the diversity boosted creativity, first of all because people who come from different backgrounds tend to approach problems differently. And I argued that migration, particularly migration into the flat white economy, actually increases the creativity even of the indigenous population through challenging them and making them think in different ways. So I'm very much in favor of diversity in that sense. But I do think, and I'm particularly thinking of the MPC here, that it is so important that the MPC is diverse in the way that people think about the subjects that matter. There's never really been a monetarist on the MPC. And you'd think if you were forecasting inflation, that would be something that you'd want to take into account. Monetarists don't get it right all the time. In fact, they get it wrong quite a lot of the time. But you just want to have one there, challenging the views of the others to give a different point of view. Now, I'm going to talk my book here again. I think that much more attention should be paid to the consultancy sector. The consultancy sector in the UK is the world center of international economic consulting. As proportion of GDP, economic consulting in the UK is higher than anywhere else in the world. And it's actually a huge contributor to the economy. The UK economic consultancy sector is bigger in its revenue terms than the film industry. So we ought to take it a bit more seriously. And I would argue that we are held up to the mark. If we get our forecast wrong, we lose our clients. And fortunately, we've been lucky in keeping our clients. But God, you do have to work pretty hard and keeping very up to date to be able to keep them there. But it does mean that you are very open to bits of factual knowledge and to changes in what is going on. I do think the authorities have been quite slow in predicting various things, but let me just give you an example where I think they were on the ball. The furlough scheme was announced very soon after the pandemic went live and started to have a dramatic impact. It was announced extremely quickly, and I think has proved extremely successful in helping prevent the scale of crisis that we could have had. We could have had a very much more severe economic crisis had we not had really timely action, first in this country and then copied in other countries. We were one of the first to get into a scheme like this, and I think it made a huge difference. Particularly, it affected the labour market. It affected also the ability of employers to be able to continue. It meant the scale of the damage, the long-term damage, done to the economy from the pandemic was very much reduced. We were probably too slow to turn it off, but it's easy to say that kind of thing with 2020 hindsight. On the other hand, some of the other things, I think, have been quite slow to predict. I had a running debate with Andy Haldane about the banks getting various things wrong, and offered that some of us from the consultancy sector would be very happy to help him. He somewhat ignored the offer, even though we offered to do it free of charge, which, you know, as a consultant, you can imagine, is the sort of thing that it's quite painful for us to have to do. But we thought that it would be for the good of the country, and so on. But it's not been taken. Now, The Economist has come up with this view. It's just their version of go woke, go broke. They've said that central banks have got far too keen on promoting diversity, on being concerned about the environment, and they've got interested in all these exciting causes. And their argument is that central banks have got bored with price stability, and by implication, that's why they've failed to preserve price stability. Actually, I don't think that criticism actually holds. It may be true for some bankers, it may be true for some central bankers, but if you actually look at what the MPC has been focusing on, the reason they've got their forecast wrong is not because they're thinking about something other than their task. If you look at the minutes, it's just simply bad forecasting. It's not to do with them promoting the environment or promoting diversity. you'll be pleased to know. At least that's my view. So I absolve them of that specific criticism. Now, even if the authorities had predicted inflation, could they have done anything about it? Well, I think the answer, and if you look back to the 70s, there's a bit of evidence about what you can do and what you can't do. What you don't want to be doing is being Dennis Healey, turning your taxi round at Heathrow Airport and coming back, having realized that the economic crisis is so big you really don't want to go to the IMF meeting, and instead you send some officials. If the currency is collapsing, that's something that you have got wrong and something that you need to sort, which is what we eventually had to do in the 1970s. But if you look at the other side, there were two countries that essentially tried, gosh, should I sing along? Two countries that essentially tried to escape from the 1970s bout of inflation worldwide. They were Switzerland and Germany. They let their currencies shoot up. Now, the first thing is they only halved the rate of inflation. They still got up to double-digit inflation in both countries. The second thing is they faced a very, very, very large fall in output, which they got away with because both of those countries at that stage had a system called Gastarbeiter, which was people, they were called guest workers, and if they lost their jobs, they could be sent home. Now, that's the sort of thing that people did in that time. It's not the sort of thing they do now. And I don't think Priti Patel's plans for Rwanda quite mean that any migrant losing their job would be sent to Rwanda. In fact, I doubt very much if anyone will go to Rwanda. So there was a cost, and I doubt if the cost was one that would A, be acceptable, and B, actually be worth paying to try and opt out of an international bout of inflation. So I think as far as policy is concerned, you want to stop your currency collapsing. And of course, the currency against the dollar has gone down 10% since the end of February. But you probably don't need to do much more than that. You just have to take the pressures and deal with them. And to some extent, inflation is its own cure if it causes a sufficient squeeze in living standards to lead to recession. What do we think is going to happen? Well, the price of oil, we think, will fall back because we will see increases in supply in certain parts of the world, and we will see reductions in demand as the world economy slows down. We're reasonably convinced about the price of oil falling back. Okay, the price of gas we don't think will do so. We don't think the price of gas will fall significantly in Europe until the gas terminal in Germany opens, which is scheduled for 2024. Until that happens, we think it's going to be very hard to bring down the price of gas as people start pushing off, start avoiding taking Russian gas as Russian gas becomes less acceptable. Now, what is the consequence of inflation for the consumer? It's sort of well known that the poor spend more on fuel, energy, and food than the rich. Until I actually did this analysis, I hadn't appreciated the scale and the shape of the curve. What it shows, this has just taken the figures from last year's Food and Expenditure Survey, is the poorest 40% all spend not too different a share of their total expenditure on food, fuel, and energy. The thing that keeps pushing it up the income scale is you have higher dependence on spending on cars and fuel for their cars of the sort of Theresa May's just about managing group. So you've got 40% of the population who get hit particularly heavily by this. It's not just the bottom 10%. And that is something which slightly surprised me. it means that the problem of compensating to the extent it's possible is a much more difficult problem than I thought it would be. Even so, I've been amazed that the government hasn't done more to compensate the worst off. I'd expected them to do so, and I'm a bit surprised they haven't, because they have actually gained quite a lot of increased revenue, particularly through the freezing of the personal allowances. Will inflation stay high? Well, we're rather with the bank that it will fall back quite quickly next year, because we think the recession will do that. We think squeezing out the last 5% of inflation may prove a bit more difficult, and that we don't agree with them. We don't think inflation falls automatically back down to 2% within the 2-year horizon. We think it could take 3 or 4 years to get it down to 3%. But we do think the first bit of the fall. But the price of that will be a recession. And that I think we have to put up with. What about the impact of inflation on the business sector? Well, business really gets hit by a triple whammy. At the moment, business still has some pricing power and so can pass through cost increases, and indeed, in some cases, pass through more than the cost increases, as we've seen with some petrol stations recently. But we expect that that pricing power will erode very rapidly over the next 12 months, and we think that profits will come substantially under strain as the economy moves from red hot to icy cold in a very short period. The second issue, as far as business is concerned, is the working capital requirement of inflated prices for raw materials and other inventories, other inputs. The third is that the tax system is not indexed, which means that other than those bits of your inventory that you financed through borrowing, and companies are very cautious about borrowing from banks these days, other than those bits financed by borrowing where your interest payments at least are tax deductible, you get taxed on not only your real profits, but also your inflationary profits. Stock relief was abolished. So you don't get that impact now, and it does mean that you pay a higher real rate of tax in inflationary times than you pay in non-inflationary times. So, what am I saying? I don't think we'll get out of the current bout of inflation without a recession. So I'm in agreement with the Bank of England. I think they've got their forecast right for once. I think inflation will diminish after a tough year, which will be really tough for living standards. Incidentally, although higher pay would make the short-term living standard problem less bad, it would make inflation persist for longer. So I'm not convinced that higher pay is a solution itself. The bottom 40% of the income distribution get hit disproportionately. And it is important that measures to deal with inflation target not just the very poorest, but quite a lot of the people above the very poorest. I think policy making and especially forecasting can be improved substantially, but even had the bank in this case got its forecast right, what could they have done about it? Well, the answer is they'd still have faced a very unwelcome trade-off, and one that would be quite a tough one to make. On the other hand, you don't want to get into the situation that Dennis Healey was in 1975, when he had to turn back at the airport. And finally, as I said, the corporate sector is eventually going to get hit. It may look nice at the moment. You can put your prices up at the moment. The economy is still running. Demand is fairly high, and you can get inflationary pricing, get away with inflationary price increases. That's going to change, and there will be the triple whammy of squeezed profits, extra working capital requirement, and in addition, a higher real rate of tax. So that's how I see it. We're in for quite a tough time. Things could be done that could alleviate some of the pain, but realistically, we're still going to have to face quite a big part of the pain. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Douglas. I think you've opened up quite a debate for us with your speech. My apologies also, I didn't introduce some of my fellow. I've got Vicky Price, who should be sitting here, but it's one of the members of the committee, introducing our first main topic, and Tony Cox, will be introducing our second main topic. For now, I want to introduce, if I may, Paul Lewis, a well-known broadcaster and journalist, indeed, who's interviewed a number of the people in this room. Paul will combine some more details of what inflation means for us, especially for consumers. Thank you, Paul.
Inflation from a consumer point of view. Now, I must say, you've heard it, but I'm a journalist, a financial journalist. I'm not an economist, I'm not a statistician. But I do know that this tenner, which I took out before Christmas, will be worth £9 next Christmas. And when I introduced my Twitter followers to that £9 note, I got an absolutely huge response, because for the first time for more than 30 years, inflation is out of control. One of the problems is half the population has never known inflation, but they're learning. They learn it every time they go to shop. Their money will buy less, or they have a bill to pay. Now, in 1993, I was sent to Moscow to do a story about pensioner poverty. The Soviet Union had collapsed 2 years earlier. In 1992, inflation hit 2,600%. The Yeltsin government tried to ameliorate it for pensioners by raising the state pension every 3 months. But by the time the new rate began, the old rate had already halved in value. And outside metro stations, I found people, lines of pensioners trying to sell things, not prized possessions, they'd all gone. Bunches of wild rocket that they'd picked in the woods, or milk and bread they'd spent hours queuing for and could sell at a premium to busy commuters who didn't have time for the bureaucratic procedures of Russian shops. And I visited a small Moscow flat of 72-year-old Nikolai Andreevich Yasinski. In his 20s, he had lost his leg in defending Stalingrad, a war hero. But Nikolai couldn't afford fresh vegetables, never mind meat. He lived on soup, porridge, and potatoes. He was a victim of that inflation. And he told me, I don't understand what's happening. After the war, he said, Stalin told us the price of bread, and it came down each year. Now he didn't know if he could afford half a loaf at tomorrow's prices. But he was lucky in a way, Nikolai, because he didn't have to choose between eating and heating. His flat was kept warm, next to nothing it cost him, by a communal heating system. In the UK today, it is very different. The main fear of our pensioners, people with disabilities, low-income families with young children, is that even if they can't even afford today's heating bills as the summer approaches, and when prices go up again in October, it'll be the start of winter. Now, I say prices will go up. We don't have Stalin here to fix our prices. We do have the next best thing, Ofgem. The regulator now controls the price of gas and electricity after the false market in domestic energy it created collapsed last year. And unlike Stalin, of course, it puts up prices. And not just because of world events like the rising demand for gas after lockdown and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it puts them up to pay for green subsidies, to pay for smart meters and network costs. And it makes certain that these amounts are paid and can't be avoided by putting on a jumper or turning down the thermostat, because they're loaded onto the standing charge, especially the electricity standing charge. It's already £165 a year. From next April, it will have another £40 added to it to recoup the £200 that the Chancellor is making them take off electricity bills this autumn. Standing charges on prepayment meters, mainly used by poorer households, are even higher, £184 a year. So even if you disconnect yourself from the units of electricity coming in, and you have none, you will pay the standing charge £3.53 every week. And if you have gas as well, £6.15 a week, to sit in a cold home with no electricity, where you can't even cook soup porridge and potatoes if you wanted to. That's the reality of inflation for consumers now. And if predictions of the October price cap are right, and the Bank of England and the Chief Executive of Scottish Power kind of agree about this, the typical fuel bill from October will take a third of the average state pension. And for younger people on universal credit, it'll take two-thirds of their money for a typical fuel bill. And fuel poverty begins when you spend 10% of your income to keep warm. This won't be fuel poverty, it'll be fuel destitution. Now, I'm sure you've read reports of families every day in the news, children where a parent doesn't eat 2 days a week so the kids can. And today, Age UK says pensioner poverty, fears of a cold winter. This is what inflation does, and this winter, it will kill people. No mistake. Now, I remember high inflation in the 1970s, but as I said, half the population don't. They either weren't born or they're too young to notice at the time. Because for the whole of this century, until last year, inflation has been low. At one point, we were fretting about how to cope with negative inflation. We were even entering a new Victorian age when prices were stable and wages rose, doubling prosperity in the 80 years of her reign? Well, I guess not. It's back. And this time, it does seem personal. Now, as I said, I'm a financial journalist, not an economist or a statistician. I used to be on television a lot more than I am now, and in fact, I'm not on at all now. A few years ago, I was in my local supermarket, and a woman came up to me and said, "Are you that man?" What man? The man on the telly. Well, sometimes. You talk about money. Yes, on breakfast TV. She paused and looked at me and she said, "Are you an economist?" I said, "No, I'm not an economist, I'm a journalist." And she looked into my trolley and said, "Oh yes, I can see that now," and walked off. In August 1976, inflation peaked at 27% nearly, a £10 note worth then £7.50 a year later. And that, I say 26.9%, that of course was the RPI, the Retail Prices Index. And I'm very fond of the RPI. It was born about the same time as me. And it's featured in my adult working life and writing about it since I was 25. And we never doubted that the RPI was how you measured inflation. And from the 1980s, it was how benefits and tax allowances rose each year. And it was the benchmark for wage rises. Now, of course, we argued whether it reflected accurately what we would now call the lived experience of pensioners and poor families. There was even a pensioner price index by ONS for some time. But at least it was one continuous series. Now, statisticians may argue that how the data was collected and how the arithmetic was done, and although 26.9% may not have been exactly how prices rose in the 12 months to August 1976, we knew it was too high. Now, CPI has been back calculated by ONS, and it would have been 24.5%. So what? I mean, 26.9, 24.5, the key thing was it was getting worse. The RPI got bigger, and when inflation eased, RPI got smaller. That is all the public needed to know. But now, the Office for National Statistics doesn't know how to calculate inflation. If it did, it wouldn't produce 3 price indices. Is it 6.2%? Is it 7%? Is it 9%? Now, I know a lot of work goes into it, chucking things out of the basket of goods, putting them in. Donuts and encyclopedias are out. Indoor climbing wall lessons and pet collars are now in. And in the supermarket, people look and say, "What's in your shopping trolley?" "Oh, a pet collar and a climbing session." "No donuts, I see. You must be a statistician." And you move from the arithmetic mean to the geometric mean to aggregate the prices of meat-free sausages and dried herbs. Are they really that important? Now, the smallest of those 3 rates, ONS's headline rate, which no one except the water regulator, Ofwat, uses in the real world, CPIH. That, incidentally, is an acronym for Consumer Prices Index, including imputed rents to give a measure of the cost of owner-occupied housing, the world's longest acronym, which I suspect is why it's struggled to get recognition as a national statistic for some time. The Oxford English Dictionary put in an objection. But no one except ONS quotes it. The CPI is the rate every newspaper and radio bulletin uses, and that's the one the government uses to increase benefits, not least, of course, because it's always lower than the RPI. And when tax allowances aren't frozen, those as well. The venerable Retail Prices Index is used to put up things that bring in money for the government, like landfill tax, train fares, interest on student loans. RPI isn't even a national statistic anymore, but ONS has to issue it, and that is not least because a quarter of government gilts are linked to the RPI. So the government is paying 9% interest on £819 billion of index-linked gilts to those lucky enough to have them. Barclays Bank still pays 0.01% on its everyday saver, 900 times less. Now, that debt's so expensive that the government plans to change the RPI formula. From February 2030, RPI will be recalculated, so in effect, it's CPI-H, dressed in the clothes of RPI, but with a beating heart of geometric means. And in 2030, I can see Prime Minister Angela Rayner telling Parliament that RPI will now be used for the April 2031 benefit increase. Well, you laugh, well, some of you do, but surely you remember that in June 2022, Keir Starmer was fined and resigned. Angela Rayner wasn't, paving the way for her to head the Labour Party and lead it to victory in June 2024, and of course an easy re-election in 2029. And at the start of her second term, cutting benefits by using RPI, it actually became an offence to call it CPIH, would be a useful cost-saving measure, just as George Osborne moved benefit rises from RPI to CPI in 2010, 2011 to save money. There is a serious point here. If inflation hits its forecast of, let's say, 9 or 10% in September, will the government really raise benefits in April 23 by CPI? It resiled from using earnings of 8.3% for the pension rise this April. And remember, in 1976, faced with a very large rise in prices, the Labour government changed how benefits were put up. It moved from raising them benefits with inflation as it was in the past to a forecast, much more sensible, let's see what they'll be next April. And they cut off that peak inflation by doing that. Now, of course, we don't know what inflation will be this autumn. We only know what the Bank of England last week forecast it would be, 10% then. But then, that's the same bank which says it'll be 2% in 2 years' time. It always says that. It has to. That's its mandate. It forgets that's a target, not a forecast. Inflation can't be predicted, and that's largely, in my view, because we don't actually understand it. And if the bank doesn't understand it, how can it control it? Now, this has been its job since 1997. The 9 people who sit on the Monetary Policy Committee cost us £2.5 million a year in salaries alone. The bank spends £40 million on monetary policy a year, at least it did in the last year. And they sit around for a month deciding whether to put rates up or down by 0.25% to keep inflation on target. Now, I said in 1997, when the bank was first given the job, it only had one lever to pull to control a highly complex problem, and it wouldn't work, was my view. And when it didn't, of course, the governor writes a letter of excuses to the Chancellor. Uneven price pressures, global factors, supply constraints. That's the latest, but to be honest, it could have been any letter written by any governor to any chancellor since the system began. They're all published on the nothingtodowithus.gov website. When inflation fell, the bank invented a second lever, quantitative easing. It then became the Money Tree Policy Committee, magicking £895 billion out of thin air, and astonishingly, printing money led to higher inflation. And then we left the EU trade area, lockdown ended, oil prices rose, and Russia invaded Ukraine. So, hands back on the interest rate lever. Now, that's designed to dampen economic activity at home. And when Brexit red tape, the lockdown and shortage of key components and workers were already dampening it, it can only mean stagflation. Now, I'm fairly well paid. Many people anyway in this room are fairly well paid. And if inflation is 2% or 5% or 10%, it's noticeable and annoying when I go out for a meal or buy a bottle of wine, but I won't be cold. I won't be hungry because I have spare cash to mop it up. But if you already spend every penny you have on essentials, and remember, to claim universal credit, you need a smartphone, then 10% inflation is a massive issue. And 100% rise in the cost of heating your home, running medical equipment if you're disabled, and cooking your food is a major blow. People in that position have no cushion. They can't give up meals out, rock climbing lessons, theatre trips, or their car, because if they have one, they need it to get to work. They won't be buying pet collars. The dog died in January, and they couldn't afford to replace it. They just get more jumpers from Oxfam and ask the food bank for all tins, please, because we can't cook fresh food. We need a new way to measure inflation, not arguing about geometric or arithmetic or even harmonic means. Not one index for all people, whether inflation bothers them or not, but looking at the real experience of real people living real lives on real incomes, finding out the effects on them of raising prices and how it drains their income, drives them into debt, and then telling the Bank of England, now we know what it is, control it, it's your job. And telling politicians, sorry, it's so high, deal with it. Economists don't understand what causes it. The Bank of England doesn't know how to control it. Statisticians can't even agree how to measure it. And politicians, they just want the rate that will save them the most money. And yet inflation in the real world is set to undermine millions of lives over the next 2 years, and this will soon be worth that. Thank you.
Of course. It's your turn now, I think. Thank you very much, Paul. I think our keynote speakers have laid out the problems that we know we're facing. I'm not sure we'll get to many conclusions today, but thank you very much indeed, Paul. Are there any questions?
I see the support of the currency effectively as a sort of cliff edge. If you go too close to the edge and you fall over, the trouble you cause in trying to fight your way back is awful. And therefore what you need to do is prevent a currency collapse, which is what Denis Healey had to deal with back in 1975 and 1976. Beyond that, I'm not convinced that the cost of getting inflation down through a mixture of fiscal and monetary policy would be justified. I think the costs would be greater than the benefits. I think inflation will fall eventually, and I think to some extent what we have to do is deal with the problem and cushion it for those who are worst afflicted by it. I think that's much more important than simply saying let the currency shoot right up, as happened in Switzerland and Germany in the 1970s, which led to very sharp falls in employment and led to them sending their migrant workers back home.
Thank you. So yes, our next session is the topic of what is the cause of inflation? And Vicky is our
Certainly. Thank you very much. I thought those were really good introductory sessions and speeches from our two first speakers, Paul Lewis and Doug McWilliams. So thank you very much for setting the scene. It certainly got us all slightly worried. So I hope that the next presentations will give us some relief. And of course, we have Robert Choate here too, who is the person who's going to be taking over as the head of the UK Statistics Authority. And hopefully what you've heard a little bit about those statistics and what they mean, and do they mean what they should be meaning, and are we measuring inflation properly? It's going to be something that will be debated, I think, later on today, this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be able to work with you a lot more, Robert, in the future. So it's my pleasure then to introduce the next set of speakers. Now we're going back, since Paul Lewis, spoke about the causes of inflation, as did Doug. We're going to be looking at them in a bit more detail right now. So the first speaker is Steve Farrington, Chief of Staff of the OBR, since we talked about that, and Doug did. So, and of course, Robert used to be head of it. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Maxine. I should say straight off that the rather more technocratic tone of my presentation is probably likely to compare pretty unfavourably to what you just heard from Paul. So I will do my best to bring to life a discussion of our forecast for GDP deflator inflation, but I suspect they may have rather less impact, but there we go. I should also say, just while the slides are coming up, it's also a pleasure to be back speaking at a conference in person for the first time, at least in the UK, since COVID began. So it's very nice to be back to see everyone. Although it takes some getting used to, I managed to get on the wrong train twice this morning on the way in. So there's a bit of a bumpy re-entry to being back in the office. Great, thank you very much. So I should just go back one. I wanted to start by setting out that I've been asked to answer the question that you can see on your screen, to which there are two possible answers. But I'm an economist, so my two answers are it's both and it depends. So let me try and be more helpful. This chart shows a collection of CPI inflation forecasts. The OBR's most recent inflation forecast was published on the 23rd of March. It's the blue line that shows that we expect a peak in inflation at the end of the year of above 8%, as is now pretty familiar to all of you, which would be the highest peak since the early 1980s. You can also see that there is some inflation in inflation forecasts. The bank's more recent forecast now predicts inflation will reach double digits, as we've already heard, and was certainly on the front pages of the newspapers recently, reflecting the stronger outturn data since we published our forecast in March. But perhaps the more interesting line for the question I want to answer is, in fact, the yellow one. It shows our forecast from October last year, when we were forecasting that inflation would rise to around 4.5%, CPI inflation forecast. So that forecast is close to the more recent peaks of a little over 5% in 2008 and 2011. The 2011 increase was partly driven by the reversal of a temporary cut in VAT, so it's somewhat distorted by that. But the 2008 rise was driven by a similar rise in commodity prices. So there was a 30% rise in electricity bills and a 50% rise in gas bills in 2008, which led to a spike in inflation of around 4.5%. But so it's interesting that we were already close to that level in October, even though the increase in commodity prices was really only part of the story back then. And actually, part of what was driving our inflation forecast was the expectation that domestic demand pressures and the persistence of the global supply bottlenecks that were certainly talked about more frequently around at the end of last year were likely to constrain supply and push up inflation. But of course, that forecast has not done well. We know that the picture changed dramatically following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'll leave it to others to decide whether it's reasonable to expect the OBR to, or others to need to anticipate this eventuality, but there we go. And what I would say, though, is looking at the chart, in particular on the left of the movements in gas prices, to please spur a thought for the forecasters who were trying to pin the tail on the gas price donkey through the course of February and March as gas price futures curves were moving around dramatically over this period. In fact, at one point, intraday prices reached over £5 per therm. So we were faced with the blue line essentially moving about between the yellow line and a level of £5 over a course of days and weeks, and trying to decide where to place our bet. So it's there's a bit of a relief that the latest futures curve as of yesterday is not too far away from the assumption in our forecast, at least for 2022. So there's no dramatic reason to revise our forecast on the basis of that curve, although you can see a change in expectations further out, which would be material. It's also worth noting that what would normally have been a headline-dominating increase in oil prices has been relegated very much to the second paragraph of news stories, although its contribution to inflation is also pretty dramatic. So to try and address the question that I posed at the start in terms of the relative contributions of domestic and global pressures to inflation in the UK, this chart breaks down the component contributions to our inflation forecast to try and identify the extent to which it is high commodity prices driving inflation relative to domestic demand pressures. And those higher global energy prices that I just talked about feed into our forecast for domestic consumer prices in 4 stages. The first is directly and immediately through the impact of higher oil prices on the pump price of petrol and other fuels. That's the yellow bar you see in the charts. Also directly, but with a little bit of a lag, from the impact of higher gas prices on the Ofgem energy price cap, which, as we all now know, is reset in April and October each year. So there's a built-in lag from the pass-through of wholesale prices to retail prices, and you can see that in the blue utilities bars. There is also an indirect contribution via higher prices for goods and services that use energy in their production, which comes through somewhat in the red bars and to a lesser extent to the green bars in this chart. And finally, there is a slightly disinflationary effect from the impact of on aggregate demand from the increase in higher energy prices, which has obviously significantly eroded real disposable incomes and was one of the headlines when we published our forecast alongside the spring statement back in March. So you can see that the picture is largely one driven by global commodity price increases, but they will lay it onto a smaller increase in more domestically driven price pressures, essentially the crudely proxied by the green bars, which you can think of as goods and services that are slightly more insulated to those sort of external price pressures or imported costs. But increases there were also driven by the global supply bottlenecks that I talked about a little bit earlier, but also some tightening in the domestic labour market here in the UK. Now, I couldn't speak at this audience without talking about different measures of inflation, and that there is, as everyone in this room knows very keenly, and no doubt better than me, there's more than one way to measure inflation. But what I am going to do is extremely tentatively assert that for the purposes of this question, the difference between RPI and CPI inflation forecasts, which is obviously material for the public finances and public policy, is not the right way to get at my question of the relative role of domestic or imported prices, but actually to highlight the distinction with the much less familiar GDP deflator inflation measure. So why do I say that? Well, now if you think people don't understand what inflation is, I mean, it's true, they don't. People know what jobs are, they know what prices are. Some people know what GDP is, some people know what inflation is. Nobody knows what GDP deflator inflation is, apart from you, so well done. Very roughly speaking, it is a measure of inflation in domestically produced goods and services, as imports are essentially not counted in GDP. That's one of the purposes of the measure, even though those imports are obviously used and consumed in the UK, so do show up in the CPI. Now you should ignore the weird spike of the green line, which looks a lot like a spreadsheet error. It is not. It is a change in measured government consumption prices, which appeared in the GDP deflator inflation. I won't detain you with why that appears that way, other than to say that is how the ONS have chosen to measure those prices. But it's not material to the question here. You can see on this measure that inflation has doubled from 2 to over 4%. And that is the effect of the increase, and that shows that because imports are not counted in this measure, that it is the effect of increases in global commodity and import prices that largely account for the double-digit rates that we see in the more familiar rates of headline inflation. So, just to conclude, it is our assumption that the increase in imported inflation does not feed through into wider domestic inflationary pressures to a significant degree. In part, that is due to the actions of the Bank of England, which are currently ongoing in terms of increasing interest rates to dampen domestic inflationary pressures. And that explains why we expect the measures that I showed in this chart to all come back together in 2024 to close around the 2% inflation target. That forecast, as I say, is importantly conditioned on an expectation that global commodity prices do indeed fall back from the peaks that we've seen, and that the Bank of England in particular, but also fiscal authorities, are successful in containing any pass-through of those pressures into the wider domestic price setting, wage setting process. But as we always say in our forecast and always try and emphasise, there are obviously risks to the outlook, and I certainly, as my old boss Robert would always say, don't bet the farm and any particular forecast ultimately proven to be correct. Think about the risks around those forecasts as well. Thank you.
Steve, may I ask a quick question? I've decided to just change the format a little bit. Tony's going to never let me chair any of this again. I think what you're saying is that international prices, the changes since the Ukraine war, haven't really had much of an impact. But that it was all happening already and it's been up to a point, and they're all going to disappear at some point. But of course, that depends crucially on how long the wars last, what happens to oil prices in the future, which most people think are going to slow down, just as we heard from Doug. But also what happens if, indeed, Germany and the others really either get cut off from gas there or they decide to do it themselves. So the uncertainties in this forecast must be enormous, I'm guessing, unless you're pretty confident there's going to be a real recession, as Doug was saying, which is going to just, bring things down. So quite significantly. So which side is the most, are you more confident on the recession coming and bringing prices down, or that, in fact, we're going to see an end to the war quite quickly and prices will stabilize as a result? Yes.
I think what I'd say is that look, we are no experts in global commodity markets, and so our forecast is deliberately conditioned on the futures curve, so the people out there who do understand these markets and are placing real money on them. So we have taken essentially the sort of the central weighted average of the market expectations for what will happen to commodity prices, and that embodies a different range of views of what will happen in Ukraine and the German policy responses and so on. And that's clearly a rapidly moving situation. What I would say is that since we produce our forecast, there is some evidence that perhaps global commodity prices, at least in the near term, are a little bit weaker from a very high level than we had in our forecast, although slightly more persistent in the medium term, but that domestic inflationary pressures are perhaps a little bit higher than we thought in March, which is a slightly self-serving way of saying that I think the risks around our forecast remain balanced, but largely due to the benefit of offsetting errors.
Thank you very much. Still, it's comforting, and maybe sort of Paul Lewis's concern about the inflation, what it will mean, maybe eased a little bit as a result of this. Let's hope so. So if we can perhaps get Sean, who's an independent economist, to take us through mainly the rise in oil prices.
Firstly, thank you. I'd like to address some points that have already been made. One of the ironies of this thing is, last week I was explaining about the GDP deflator that Steve was just talking about. Now, unfortunately, at the minute, the GDP deflator is somewhere between a nonsense and a complete nonsense. That big peak in the chart there's but I won't go on about that. If you're interested in the COVID inquiry, there's a bit on economics, that was me, and I explained what happened there. Paul mentioned that RPI-linked gilts will pay 9% at the minute. Well, next month it will be 11%. But here's something for you. You'll have lost money this year. Finally, on Douglas's point, this is a really awkward one because this is coming to my subject of energy prices. I was in a discussion this morning about the volatility in them, looking at it, $113 to $101 in a day, which made us argue that there's no price. If there's no price and price discovery, there can't be inflation, can there? So there's a real philosophical issue on this before I get to my point here and to show you actually what has been going on. Now, thank you to Bishop Hill on Twitter for this, but the point here is what I'm showing is what's happened to energy prices. I think that's pretty clear. But there's two sections to this. And the first starter is a failure of policy in the UK, where we ended up in quite a mess. We've come into unreliable sources of power. People will differ on the exact points of that. But if you look at the first peak in the curve, that was already happening before Ukraine. Ukraine has made worse an existing problem because it's pressurised us in areas that were very difficult. And as you can see, there's been an extraordinary sweep up in the price. What was that there? It took quite a while for the line to get above 100. Now we've seen above 500. There have been all sorts of movements from day to day, back to my point of what price is there. And I'll give you a swing element from, here we go. Yesterday, in wind power, we got 13 gigawatts. Over the weekend, we dropped below 1. One of the problems of that is the issue of how you balance a grid when that sort of thing's going on, as the wind ebbs and flows, solar ebbs and flows, and so on. You can see there is another of the price, and this is one of the things that Paul mentioned earlier. The list of things that have been added to the bills, these have piled up, left us vulnerable. Now it's hitting us, partly because of that situation. But there's been a further kicker from Ukraine. Gas is a lot more expensive. Gas is, in economics terms, the marginal price here. It shoots up, the others go with it. Now, where does that take this? Because here we're looking at inflation. Now, I'm going to give you 3 letters that have become very unpopular, but I'm about to explain how they've performed extremely well. They are R, P, and I. Why? Because next month, 54% increase will come into the inflation figures from energy. The RPI will show an increase of approximately 2.4%. You can do the numbers in various ways. It goes from 2.3 to 2.5. Sadly, the 2.5% is my own numbers and my own energy bill, but there you go. So that will reflect the situation quite strongly. Now, the official measure, which I think in many respects is a disgrace, CPIH, that Paul mentioned earlier, will be 1.3%. Why? Well, because of the way that these things are weighted in the system. And this is a real problem because I listened to Paul earlier saying that pensioners, it'll be 1/3 of their income on energy bills this year. Universal credit, 2/3. So, 1/3, 2/3. CPIH, 2.7%. Not even remotely near, is it? RPI is a lot better at 4.5%. So, the measure that has lost its national statistics status, 2022, will represent people's experience far, far better. And if we just step forward to October, now the numbers have changed quite a bit, but if we look at the expectations from the OBR, then the RPI will go up by another 1.8%. So that's 4.2% this year. CPIH, 1.1. So that means in total it'll only do 2.4. Which one do you think represents how it's going to be better? We can take the numbers further and compare it, say, to the Bank of England inflation target. That's 2%. But the RPI is going to do more than that in 1 month on energy prices, isn't it? So We can also spin the numbers round another way. If that is, and the average bill is £2,000, and CPIH is right, then the average income is £74,000 a year. Does anyone believe that? So there's a lot of different ways, as Paul said earlier, of measuring inflation, but my argument is that it's the RPI that actually is representing it at best. Why is that? Well, you see, there's another factor in here that the Bank of England target completely ignores, owner-occupied housing. That's something else in terms of expenses that's been ticking away at, but it's not in CPI. Again, as Paul mentioned, imputed rents, rental equivalents, is in CPIH. What's going on there? Well, according to them, housing inflation is 2.7% because they take it from rents. That's not even the number for rents. If you go to Zoopla, last year's figures, last quarter, 8.3%. If you take the numbers from Goodlord for April, this is just for England, 10%. Why is that so? I'll introduce you to one of the quirks of the system here. Rent for March isn't rent for March. It's moved over the last 18 months. If I take you back to the point that I started with, which is that things are unstable within the day, sometimes within the hour, you can see what a mess is trying to measure it over 18 months works and tell people what's happening. So that's completely out. So 2.7%. Let me bring you back to the RPI again. Housing inflation, 8.8%. More believable, isn't it, if you go round? There's been a change recently in the mortgages situation. Got a bit more expensive, so inflation's 4% there. House prices, 11%. Depreciation, they call it, but house prices are what they mean. Dwellings insurance, 23.7%. We're getting back here to the sort of numbers Paul was mentioning earlier. So I hope that I've given you a sort of picture of not only what's happening, but how we're trying to measure it, and in some cases, in my opinion, mismeasure it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. It's just getting us straight into the next session, because after all, it is about how is inflation best measured.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tony Cox. I chair the RPI CPI user group, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next session. We've heard a little bit about the causes of inflation and some of the effects. We've also touched on measurement, but the next session is going to focus on how we measure inflation. And I would argue that how we measure inflation is extremely important. It enables us to move from the anecdotal feelings we might have about changing prices to get a more reliable picture of how prices are actually changing. And as has been mentioned, there are two broad measures, or two broad ways of measuring inflation. One is concerned with the macroeconomic measurement. For example, we can use it to compare how inflation rates are different across different countries. It's also gained particular importance in recent years since inflation is used as a target for the Bank of England in setting interest rates. But the other way of measuring inflation is to look at the household experience of inflation. And it's that I hope our next session is going to concentrate on. It's very important that we understand that, because this is the way that inflation is experienced by us all. And I would just slightly disagree with Paul on this point when he said, or he seemed to imply, what's important is the overall figure of inflation. Is it high or is it low? But I would argue actually the measurement is extremely important, because even a small difference in inflation is cumulative. And over a few years, a small difference can make a very big difference, be it tax thresholds, the way that they change, or indeed rail fares and many other things. So to talk about how we measure inflation, I'm going to introduce Jill Leyland, actually John Astin, I think, first, and his co-author, Jill Leyland, will present, and that will be followed by Mike Hardy, who's Deputy Director of Prices at the ONS. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Tony. Jill and I are co-authors of the paper that I'm going to describe briefly to you. Alphabetical order, I guess it is. Just one or two points I could pick up on from what's been said. One, on Sean's demonstration, one of the things that we don't take account of in price indices is daily or weekly changes in consumption. You know, the weights are based on a previous year's consumption. So if you're talking about gas prices, I mean, at home I have gas central heating. I've now switched it off, and I hope it'll be off until the summer. So the price is going up, but not my costs. So anyway, back to the thing. We are two boffins, I think you could say. Somebody else used the word. It reminds me of a recent cartoon in Private Eye. Two gentlemen going into a party, shaking hands. Oh, so you're a statistician. What are the chances? Anyway, let's get on with this. What have we got here? Yes. Why do we need a household costs index? Well, it's widely agreed that different consumer price indices are needed for different purposes. It's not just that statisticians can't agree on how to compile a price index, but there are needs for different types of price index. We often refer to them in sort of shorthand as macroeconomic and microeconomic, but it goes a bit deeper than that as well. So let me just run quickly through the main UK consumer price indices since the end of the war. The RPI, Retail Prices Index, was introduced primarily to provide the data needed for uprating the wages of the general population after the Second World War. RPI has lasted for many years, but is set to turn into, magically, CPIH after 2030. It's quite a long way off. Nowadays, one of its main uses is for calculating the increase in inflation-linked government bonds, which Paul mentioned earlier. And it is because of its formulation that it gives a higher inflation rate than most other indices. CPI, which used to be the HIC, which is the HICP, the EU's harmonized index of consumer prices, and by extension CPIH, was explicitly designed for macroeconomic purposes, following economic principles. Now, the CPI, as I mentioned, originated as and still is the EU's HICP, which I developed with an international team at Eurostat in the 1990s, specifically in order to provide macroeconomic indices, inflation data, for the ECB in its management of the economy of the Eurozone. Its current use by the Bank of England is entirely in keeping with its original design, though its use as an uprating index is not recommended. Now, the household cost indices, or the HCIs as they're being currently called, are currently under development by the ONS, and they aim to measure the actual experience of households on what they're paying out. There's an overall index and a range of different household groups, such as high and low income or disabled and non-disabled households. The latest publication was a week ago today, in fact, on the 4th of May. Now, I'll say a bit more about the HCIs. That's the subject of our short session this afternoon. Now, the aim of the HCI is to provide an index, if you like, a modern version of the RPI, which fits with the international definition that a CPI, and I'm quoting, is designed to measure inflation as perceived and experienced by households in their role as consumers. That's not my words, that's a phrase taken from the International Manual on Consumer Price Indices of 2004. And Jill and I have been working with each other with RSS backing since 2014, developing the concept of a household-based price index. This was launched in 2015 with our paper, which is called Towards a Household Inflation Index, which ONS used as the starting point when developing the HCIs. Now, there are several important differences between the HCI and other UK price indices. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are representative of the outgoings of many households, and thus ought to be included in a household inflation index. So on this PowerPoint, you can see a number of headings. First of all is a very important one, weighting households equally. Now, CPI and CPIH are based on total spending in the economy. That's why they're called macroeconomic indices. And therefore, they give more weight to higher spending, and therefore usually richer households. HCI aims to weight households more or less equally. The second one is to include all interest payments. These are excluded currently from CPI, CPIH. RPI includes mortgage interest payments, but nothing else. Credit card interest is now included in the HCI, and also other forms of interest on consumer debt. Taken together, as you know, these are vast. They include secured and unsecured personal loans, overdrafts, and mail order purchases. And I gather that typical credit card interest is over 20% per annum now. So this is a huge amount, and to have it not included in a household cost index would be a crime, I think. Now, the next one is giving full weight, and this would perhaps surprise a lot of people, giving full weight to non-life insurance premiums like motor insurance. This is done in the RPI, but not in the CPI. Insurance premiums cover both accident costs and the implied service charges levied by the insurance company. So this change will put a much higher weight onto insurance. This is not life insurance, which is not there. That's regarded as savings. Student loan repayments are neither in CPI nor CPIH, and nor RPI. They're too modern, I guess. Now, the HCI covers student loan repayments, and obviously, as you know, it's a major item of spending for some households. Not only the student loan repayments, but also the tuition fees that are paid up front. Now we come on to one of the most difficult ones, main owner-occupier costs. I'm not going to go into this because this is something that's been discussed by statisticians for donkey's years. But the HCI includes mortgage interest, stamp duty, and buildings insurance. Major home owner costs are excluded from the CPI, and CPI and RPI have their own methods. The question of capital repayments to the mortgage is something that we would, I think most of us would like to include, but that's still under discussion. And finally, not perhaps such a major item, the HCI will include all spending by UK residents, including their overseas expenditure, and will exclude spending in the UK by overseas residents, in contrast to the treatment in the CPI and partly the RPI. So it's all domestic expenditure. Now, as I mentioned, the latest results were published last week by ONS, and Jill is now, I think, going to take you briefly through one or two of the findings of the key results. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Just very quickly, because it's a very rich data set, and it's only time to just pick out one or 2 points. But the first slide here shows how the overall household cost index compares with CPI, CPIH and RPI, all the initials. It only goes up to the end of last year because that's all the data we have so far for the HCIs. You can see that in the early part of the period, the HCI, until about 2010 that is, which is the green line, was very close to RPI, the grey line. Now from 2010, the RPI diverges from the other series due to a number of quite well-known issues, mainly the formula effect, hugely controversial, but not ones I have time to even scratch the surface of today. Since 2010, the HCI has run somewhat above CPI on average. That's the orange series, CPI, and a little more above CPIH. Now, incidentally, at the moment, these 3 series all use the same mathematical formulations. John and I want to hope that's going to change a bit in the future, but for the moment, done so that we can compare them without compare the effect of the other differences between them. There we are. My second chart shows the HCIs for high and low income households. Now, I followed the ONS practice here in using the second income decile to represent low income households, that's the blue series, and the 9th decile, the grey series, for high income, as the 1st and 10th deciles are considered potentially vulnerable to anomalies. Over the period, low-income households experienced higher inflation than high-income households, although obviously there have been times, including the end of last year, when the reverse was true. Now have a look at CPI, again the orange line, and you will see that is very close to the high-income HCI. There are various reasons for this, but one of them is that, as John mentioned, the CPI is weighted in favour of higher-income households. Now, earlier this year, ONS published the CPI for different income deciles. So let's have a look at how these compare with their HCI counterparts. Now, the high income series at the bottom, the grey and light blue lines, are so close together you can hardly distinguish them. But when it comes to the low income households, the HCI, which is blue, runs noticeably above the orange CPI. Now, as mentioned, HCIs aim to measure inflation as actually experienced by households, or as close as one can practically get to that. So given where we are, and that's been ably explained by Paul Lewis and others, I think it shows that we need HCIs, and we very much hope that the ONS will start publishing them a bit more frequently than once a year. Finally, as mentioned, they're still being developed, and there are a number of questions to be answered about how they can be developed and may be used in the future. And there'll be a major meeting here at the Royal Statistical Society on June 28th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to look at them and how they might be developed further. It will be open to all, and I hope we'll see as many of you as possible. I should also mention that John and I are doing an update of our 2015 paper to hopefully inform the discussion there. Thank you very much.
Could I ask something? Sorry, of course. You talk about override costs, and you talk, payments to the audience. But there are a lot of overrides who don't have a mortgage, and they're not being paid by pay stamp duty if you're going to buy the house, and that the old pensioners staying as they are. So, I mean, obviously the insurance is important, but it's difficult, isn't it, to get one index even to represent override.
Yes, well, obviously the weights given to these different categories of expenditure will vary for the different groups. So for pensioners, for example, mortgage interest will probably have a very low weight indeed, because not many still have a mortgage.
There's another factor too, and that is between first-time buyers and all the rest. It's the first-time buyers that have the greatest sympathy, because they're saving your hand and month after month for a deposit. And then prices go up, of course, and interest rates possibly. Whereas once you're a house owner, I have less sympathy, so to speak, about so costly things to do, because you're generally...
Okay, sorry, we can't actually hear. We can't do that.
Sorry, I'm saying for non-first-time buyers.
Yes, it differs by years and tenure, yes. But I think we should get on now, actually, with Mike. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Hardy. I'm responsible for price statistics at the ONS. Very much enjoyed the presentation so far and the discussion that we've had. My presentation comes in two parts. Firstly, I'd like to summarise the consumer price statistics that we produce, provide a framework for those and discuss how they fit together. I'd then like to discuss the wide range of development work that we're doing to improve the quality of those statistics over the coming years. So we've already discussed the wide range of consumer price statistics that we produce. They can be categorised into two groups. So firstly, we have our economic measures. These are macroeconomic measures of inflation, which are based on economic principles. We're all familiar with the CPI. It It's the Bank of England's inflation target and widely covered in the media each month. We have developed the CPI to include a measure of owner-occupiers' housing costs. So that is the cost associated with owning, maintaining and living in your own home. And as an organisation, we see that as our most comprehensive measure of inflation. We then have our second group of indices, and they are designed to measure the household experience. So we have the household cost indices. These are experimental at this stage, and we are developing them in collaboration with our stakeholder and technical panels. They are designed to measure the changing costs and prices faced by different household groups. So you can cut the data in a number of different ways. So for example, by income decile, expenditure decile, pensioner households, households with and without children. So you can start to dig into how the recent rise in inflation is impacting different groups in UK society. We can also break down our macroeconomic measures of inflation into different groups as well. We recently published CPI broken down by different subgroups, and at the end of this week we'll be publishing CPIH broken down by different subgroups too. We've mentioned a number of times the Retail Prices Index. I haven't included it in this slide because our position as an organisation is very clear. It is not a good measure of inflation, and we do not think it has the potential to become one. We produce it as a legacy measure. I just wanted to highlight at this stage that we've done a huge amount of work as an organisation to understand the rising cost of living. I just wanted to highlight two pieces of work in particular. So on the ONS website, we have a personal inflation calculator. So anyone can visit the website, outline what they spend their money on every month, and it will give them a personal rate of inflation, and you can compare that to the headline measure. We're also doing some work on what we are describing as a least cost index, so how the prices of essential goods are changing for grocery items, which we plan to publish at the end of the month. We have a cost of living statement on our website, which summarises all of the work that we're doing in this space. So in terms of transforming our consumer price statistics, traditionally we send price collectors out across the UK to collect prices. We collect prices manually online, and we have some admin data that is sent directly to ONS. We have around 700 different items that we collect prices for every month. It's a fixed basket approach, so we set that basket at the start of the year, and then it's refreshed every year based on changing consumer spending patterns. We are moving to using different data sources. So there are a couple that I want to touch on. The first is electronic point of sale data. So whenever you go into a shop and purchase something, that information is collected by a retailer. We have been working with several of the UK's largest grocery retailers, and we now have direct data feeds coming into the ONS on a weekly basis. I'll come on to why that's hugely beneficial. And also web scraping. So we have developed the capability to scrape data directly from retailers' websites. We're also onboarding some admin data as well, which I'll come on to on the next slide. In order to utilise those data, we need to develop new methods, which we are working in collaboration with a number of National Statistics Institute and our technical panel in order to exploit those new data sources. We're having to develop new systems as well. So the conventional systems that we have used to produce our consumer price statistics simply can't handle the volume of data. So we've had to develop cloud platforms in order to produce the statistics using these new data sources. On the right-hand side is a summary of the basket of goods and services. As you can see, it's very diverse. We're initially going to focus on data from Auto Trader, which we have on used cars, and from Rail Delivery Group, which we have on rail fares. And then we're going to focus on grocery scanner data the year after, but I'll come on to the timeline on a future slide. So what are the advantages of using these new data sources? So scanner data essentially gives us a census of the prices of everything in that store. So it's a really rich source of data. And at the moment, we collect over a number of days in terms of the price collectors going into stores, but it will give us complete coverage of the month. So we'll not only have a census of all the prices in the store, but we'll have it across the entire month. So an incredibly rich source of data. And what's really important about the scanner data, it gives us the underlying quantities. So we can not only see how prices are changing, but we can see how much of each item a consumer is purchasing. So what that will allow us to do is reflect changing consumer spending patterns in real time. So when there's a shock to the economy, such as a pandemic, the war in Ukraine, if people are switching, for example, between premium to value brands, the scanner data will allow us to capture that in real time, which we're incredibly excited about. We will be using these new data sources in conjunction with our traditional collection. So as you can see, the basket that I presented on the previous slides, 700 different items, it's incredibly diverse. We'll also have to reflect the prices in smaller stores. We won't be able to have direct feeds of data for some of the smaller retailers, so it'll be a blend of different data sources. So we'll be using scanner data, some admin data, web scrape data eventually, and our traditional collection. And we'll aggregate all that data to produce our consumer price statistics. In terms of the data that we have, I mentioned that we have direct data feeds coming in to the building. That covers around 60% of the grocery market. We also have data on rail fares and used cars, which I mentioned from Rail Delivery Group and Auto Trader. The only retailer at the moment that is happy to be named is Co-op, but we have data from several retailers. So if I could just flick on to my last slide. So this is our timeline for implementation. In the summer, we will be publishing an analytical paper, and then in November, we will be publishing some sensitivity analysis. So at the beginning of next year, we will be incorporating rail and used cars data, and then the following year, we will be incorporating scanner data. Just to give you an idea of scale here, we currently use around 200,000 prices in our consumer price statistics. We'll be moving to using several hundreds of million prices every month, and that will allow us to improve the quality of our statistics and allow us to produce more granular statistics as well, which will allow us to gain a better understanding of what's driving inflation in the UK. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike? Oh, loads. Yeah.
On the rail fares and new cars, is it that whatever you're collecting until now wasn't really good enough? Because of course new cars have been a major, second-hand cars have been a major input into higher inflation in loads of places, including the US and here. Were we underestimating it until now, or still underestimating it at present?
So the collection we have is sufficient. So at the moment, we have a sample of 35 used cars. We'll be moving to using around 400,000 prices every month from Auto Trader. So that will allow us to dig into the detail a bit more and give better insights into what's driving that quite spectacular increase in used car prices over the last year.
So where would we think we've been underestimating, or which way?
Not necessarily underestimating it. We'll be publishing an analytical paper on this in the summer, so I can't comment directly on the data, but it'll give us better insights into what's driving the price change. So we can cut the data, for example, by the age of car, by make. It's really insightful.
There's another question here.
Hi, when we're looking at a very volatile period for raw material prices and stuff like that, how are you trying to capture the marginal degradation? So I work in packages and use up a while. In a period of high inflation, confectionery bars get smaller, people reformulate, and effectively you can either increase your prices or you can degrade the product if you like. And I suppose with inflation, do you manage to capture the sort of marginal degradation, size change, pack change, reformulation change?
Yeah, so the scanner data that we receive, we get the price, we get the quantity, but we also get product attribute information. So, for example, chocolate bar, how many grams the bar is, so then we can make a quality adjustment using that data. So the scanner data will allow us to do that.
Right, so you can pick up this sort of weight change, obviously you can't change whether we've changed palm oils or whatever, that sort of thing. There's a degree, but you make some sort of adjustment.
Yeah, so essentially a price per gram, a price per unit, which we can track over time, which adjusts then for the quantity changes that you're alluding to.
Okay, another question. A quick. Oh, I see John's got a question.
Can I just say, and this is not really a question, but it's to do with what Mike has been presenting. I think Jill and I both have the wish and the need that the HCI should be developed to the point where it can become a monthly index. Because seriously, if you look ahead, the RPI is no longer a national statistic. At the moment, that's the only sort of household-based index that we have. The other two, CPI and CPIH, are both macroeconomic indices. So there is a crying need for something to fill that gap. I don't expect to reply necessarily.
I can reply, John, that's fine. So as I mentioned to you, we're fully committed to developing the household cost indices. At this time, our plan is to move to a quarterly publication. But, you know, in discussions over the coming months, we can discuss what is possible moving forward. And at this point, our plan is to publish again on an annual basis next year and then move to quarterly after that. But I appreciate the need for those statistics now. So we're discussing as an organisation whether some of that can be moved forward, but it has to be considered against other priorities, such as the alternative data sources work and cost of living work.
And Mike, one from me. In your, I think it was your second slide, you split the measures of inflation between household and macroeconomic ones, but then you included the subsets of CPI and CPIH in with household. And given that the HCIs have both, even though they're experimental, they have that split, as they become fully developed, do you envisage that the HCI will take the lead there in terms of those breakdowns, rather than relying on the CPI and CPIH breakdowns for the household measure?
Yeah, in terms of the subgroups measures, once we fully develop the HCIs and publishing them on a quarterly basis, you know, they are designed to measure the changing cost of prices faced by different household groups. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thanks
Mike.
to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Most important issue of all, really, is now coming up. We've got inflation. How we measure it is difficult, complex, going to be reconsidered under actions. But the real problem is what really can we do about it? And so moving on to now, we're going to talk about the role of the Monetary Policy Committee from the Director for Monetary Analysis of the MPC, Bank of England. And so thank you very much, Fergal, for turning up and telling us about your role.
Thank you, Tony. So as Tony said, my name is Fergal Shortall. I'm the Director of Monetary Analysis at the Bank of England, the part of the bank that supports the MPC. So I just want to use this slot to give an overview of the Monetary Policy Committee's latest thinking on the outlook for inflation and the role that monetary policy is playing in getting it sustainably back to the 2% target. Thank you. Thank you very much. So many of you may have heard Andrew Bailey speak last week or seen some of the coverage of the May monetary policy report that it received in the media. So to be clear, I'm not going to say anything that the committee itself didn't say last Thursday, but let me just jump straight to the forecast for inflation that we produced last Thursday, shown in this chart here. And it's a forecast with two very clear phases. We've talked a lot about the first phase already. The first part has rising inflation driven by energy and goods prices and underpinned by a very tight labour market. But further out, the real income squeeze depresses growth, particularly around the end of this year. And in the second phase, we're likely to see some pickup in unemployment. And inflation falling back as energy and commodity prices stabilise and domestic pressures ease. So let me just go through the building blocks of that a little more slowly. And the first thing to say is, of course, that the war in Ukraine has led to further sharp rises in commodity prices and more general pressure on global supply chains. I've already mentioned that so far. Now, Russia is not a major source for UK energy, but the prices that the UK pays are set in European markets, who are dependent to a greater or lesser degree on Russian oil, on gas. We've seen a version of this chart, I think, already a couple of times today. So wholesale gas and oil prices rose sharply after the invasion, with gas prices to an historic high, that's what I'm showing here. They have fallen back somewhat, but the gas futures curve is still well above its pre-invasion level, and that's what matters with the Ofgem energy price cap on household bills. So compared to the last time we produced a forecast back in February, we've moved from the purple line to the orange line in terms of the futures curve. And if futures prices stay where they are, then that cap is going to go up by another 40% or so in October. So to be clear, consumers in the UK haven't yet felt the impact of the war on gas prices yet. That'll only be part of gas prices and bills from October onwards. That is a bit different from other countries, and it might mean that inflation peaks here later than some other countries. Now, those higher energy prices and tradable goods prices are likely to push inflation even higher in the near term, above 10% by the end of the year, as you've already seen, and put more of a squeeze on household incomes and profits. This is our inflation forecast over the next few months, just by categories over the next few months. Of course, the energy price cap has only recently gone up, as you know, to deal with the previous rise, and you can see the impact of that and what's happening to inflation right now. So that's the big increase in the purple bars in this chart here, contributing to 9% inflation, we think, over the course of the second quarter of this year. It'll climb a little bit off the page, as I mentioned. It isn't the only factor, of course. Global bottlenecks for tradable goods have driven the prices of goods prices of the CPI higher over the past year. That's the turquoise bars. Now, in the short run, it's very hard, as we've been discussing, for households to substitute away from energy. So our sense is that households may end up spending something like 8% of their disposable income on energy by Q4 this year, and that's across all households. On average, of course, as Paul went through earlier, there will be particular household low income groups who are spending a good deal more than that. But even still, for the household sector as a whole, that 8% is around double what it was only 2 or 3 years ago. I'll come back to the implications of that in a moment. In the meantime, though, in the domestic economy, the labour market remains very tight, and with businesses feeling they can begin to rebuild margins, there is also upward pressure on wages and domestic prices. Notwithstanding the war, reported business sentiment continues to hold up, and vacancies are running at record levels at the moment. So our sense is that unemployment will actually continue to fall for a little while longer, and we have 3.6% unemployment penciled in for the second quarter of this year, and that's well below even the pre-pandemic trough in unemployment. So that and the recent pickup in inflation is putting a lot of upward pressure on wage growth. Now, the headline numbers on pay are still being affected by a few pandemic-related funnies, but our own assessment is that underlying pay growth is likely to go above 5% or so in the next few months, and headline pay growth overall will be something like 5.75% over the course of this year. High-frequency indicators, such as the REC survey, the turquoise line in this chart, would be consistent with pay growth of 6% or even higher at the moment. So bringing that together, that's a long list of factors putting upward pressure on prices. We have a network of agents around the country that talk to a large number of businesses about their thoughts on pricing. There's a lot more detail on that in the monetary policy report that we published last week. But labour costs, raw materials costs, energy costs, transport costs all feature quite heavily, and the message comes through loud and clear to us that businesses wish to and feel able to raise prices by more this year than last year. Now, in a tight labour market and in an environment in which companies feel they can rebuild margins, they may be willing to grant higher wage increases for longer in the belief that they can pass on these increases to prices. Now, in the MPC's central forecast, 2 things cut this mechanism off. Goods and energy prices stabilise, taking some of the impetus away for higher domestic prices, and slack opens up as real spending is reined in. Now, on the first of these, if energy prices and tradables stabilise, that in itself will do a large amount to bring overall inflation down. Let me just go back to this chart again. Energy prices need to keep rising at recent rates for their contribution to inflation to stay elevated. So that turquoise line needs to keep going up and to the right for their upward impetus on inflation to stay. What actually will happen, of course, will depend on the war in Ukraine and its implications for European gas markets. The MPC doesn't have any more of an insight to that than anyone else does. So it assumes that energy and commodity prices stay unchanged from here. They could, of course, rise further if the geopolitical situation worsens or tighter restrictions are placed on Russian energy, and vice versa if there's some improvement. But for what it's worth, futures markets for gas and other commodity prices are downward sloping. So if anything, prices from the end of the year, suggesting falling prices from the end of the year rather than rising. Moreover, upward pressure on inflation is likely to ease further as consumers rein in spending and spare capacity opens up. So even though business sentiment is holding up, the household sector is seeing the news, seeing what's happening to their purchasing power, and consumer confidence measures are falling back quite sharply to around the levels last seen in the financial crisis. So you can see that in this chart here. I'm showing the GfK consumer confidence measure in orange against one measure of real incomes in turquoise. And the fall in confidence is about what you'd expect to see given what's happening to real labour incomes, the most visible component of incomes. Early evidence suggests that consumers are reacting to higher prices by, at best, maintaining nominal spending and cutting back in real terms. So in the MPC's central case, the signs of demand weakening, be they domestic from consumers retrenching or foreign demand slowing given geopolitical uncertainty and the hit to incomes abroad, lead to some loosening in the labour market. We're likely to see a turnaround in the unemployment picture perhaps over the second half of this year and begin to see unemployment rise a little bit over the 3-year projection that the MPC produces, finishing in this chart at around 5.5% or so. And for that reason, CPI inflation as a whole falls back in the MPC's forecast and to below target in year 3, given the margin of spare capacity. Now, MPC does see upside risks from greater persistence in wage and price setting, and will continue to act to ensure that longer-term expectations are well anchored around the 2% target. That brings me to monetary policy and the course that the MPC is charting. Russia's invasion of Ukraine means the UK is going to pay higher prices for imported energy and tradables, and monetary policy is unable to prevent this. Instead, the challenge for monetary policy is to navigate a narrow path between limiting increased risks from elevated inflation and a tighter labour market on the one hand, and limiting the further hit to activity from the reduction in real incomes on the other. MPC voted in May, as you know, to increase bank rate by 25 basis points, given that current tightness in the labour market, those continuing signs of robust domestic price pressures, and the risk that those price pressures will persist. But obviously there are different views about where we might go from here. Most on the MPC judge that some further tightening might be appropriate in the coming months, but there are risks on both sides of that, and even for some members they'd see the risks as more evenly balanced. But nonetheless, as always, the MPC will continue to set policy to meet that 2% inflation target in a way that best sustains growth and employment. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Did you MPC consider quantitative easing at this point at all?
Well, if anything, we're going in the other direction.
Really?
We announced, the MPC announced back in February that it's no longer reinvesting bonds as they mature, so the total amount of QE is beginning to fall.
Okay, fine. I'd really like to get on, if we may, and have some questions after Professor Porter's. Thank you very much for your time. Professor's going to tell us a little bit more about the effect on the labour market. You see, Professor Porter's, thank you.
I was just a bit puzzled by the bank's analysis of the labour market. So I'm coming here more with questions about what the bank and indeed other economists, including those in this room, think, and a sort of sense of slight bemusement, because I can't really figure out what's going on either, as I'll try and explain here. So this is a chart quite similar, not quite the same to the one that Fergus just shown, but it is from the same report. But it shows the projections for underlying pay growth that the MPC have published, which shows a sort of we see the pre-pandemic period of 4%. We see a whole bunch of distortions during the pandemic, which you all know about, and then we see pay growth going up to about 5%. And I think the first thing that I would say about this is that in the context of inflation going up to 8, 9 or 10%, this does not look like a wage price spiral. This looks like a still large falls in real wages, and overall pretty subdued pay growth, and in some sense not something that we should be worrying about very much. If anything, we perhaps want, given just how high inflation is, we might actually want pay growth to be a little bit higher to support demand. And the second thing, and this is where it gets really puzzling, is the sectoral composition of pay growth. Because we've had all this anecdotal stuff about labour shortages in particular sectors leading to pay rises. You get that in the press all the time. You get it from, but it's not just pure anecdote. You also get it in things like, as for so the REC survey. You get it in sort of other contexts as well. But here is the actual pay growth since the start of the pandemic, mean and median pay growth. And where is pay actually shooting up? Answer, in the finance sector. Bankers' bonuses are by far a lot of the pay growth that we've saw in the last 3 months. If you go in, and you can see this in the ONS's monthly wages survey, a lot of the pay growth that we saw in the last 3 months was quite obviously from bankers' bonuses. And it's not obvious to me that trying to push down on pay growth through raising interest rates is necessarily the right policy response to that. Not to say that the bank has any better levers in its toolbox to do that, but arguably, actually, the government does have rather better levers in its toolbox. And in particular, I'm going back to what Paul was saying earlier, the idea that the Prime Minister and Chancellor can go out and say, well, the reason that we are effectively cutting universal credit by 5% this year is because we don't want to stoke inflation. At the same time as we see these sorts of patterns in what's actually happening in the earnings distribution, seems to me to be, to put it mildly, rather gaslighting half the population of the country. But just from an economic, leaving aside the sort of social consequences, just from an economic perspective, this is rather puzzling. And it gets even more puzzling. This is changes in wages compared to changes in number of vacancies. So, what is this labour market pressure that we're seeing? Surely, on any reasonable model of the economy, you would think that changes in the numbers of vacancies would be associated with wage growth. What do we actually see? We actually see that at a sectoral level, there is really no association at all. There's no correlation in this data, right? Between the change in the between what's happening in the vacancy data and what's actually happening to wages. And indeed, if you go up here, where do we hear all these anecdotes about shortages? Well, bars, restaurants, cafes, coffee bars, pubs, whatever. Where have wages been, if anything, considerably weaker than average since the start of the pandemic? Well, that's the accommodation and food services sector. So the sort of mental model of how the labour market works, how Beveridge's curves work, how changes in vacancies translate into pay, it doesn't really seem to be explaining what's going on. And just finally, back to my own special subject, as it were, migration, which Douglas mentioned as well. This looks at, is it in fact the case that the quote exodus unquote of European workers in particular has generated these shortages, which in turn is leading to pay growth. This is my own chart, and again, if you draw a line of best fit through this, you essentially get nothing very meaningful at all. But you can see that in particular, yes, it is true that the accommodation and food services sector down there on the bottom left was indeed the one that saw the largest exodus of EU workers. It's also one that's seen relatively weak pay growth compared to pre-pandemic levels. Overall, you basically see relatively little pattern in correlating what's happening to pay and what happened to immigration during the pandemic. So you get this picture of a very odd picture of the labour market, frankly, which makes it, in my view, quite difficult to predict what is actually going to happen to pay growth overall or in specific sectors over the next 12 to 18 months. But as I said, this certainly doesn't look like the classic model of an overheating labour market generating high levels of pay growth, which in turn will feed through into cost pressures in quite the way I think that perhaps the bank's analysis at least gives the impression that they're worried about. So I'll stop there.
Can we have any... Yes, sir.
I've just got a point of clarification there, that fascinating. But did your last chart actually say that in transport there's been an increase in the share of EV workers?
Yes, that is actually what I mean. It's not true of HGV drivers, I suspect, but we don't have that disintegration of data. But overall, the transport and logistics sector pre-pandemic, and that's actually that is not the somewhat unreliable. I'm not trying to offend the audience. The slightly dodgy labour force survey data, that's actually the HMRC data of the number of employees on payroll. Now, that may reflect some shift between self-employment and employment, and actual employees that were coming on to payrolls during the pandemic. So there may be some distortion there, because that counts just of the number of people who are actually paying PAYE income tax as opposed to self-employment. But that is what their data shows, yes.
But do you think I was prediction?
No, I wouldn't have predicted any of this. I'm not claiming that I spotted any of this.
No, thank you. I think it does. Any other questions? Yes, Tony.
I've got a question for Fergal. I'm not sure if it's a fair question, but we're all familiar with the fact that rail fares go up each year with a measure of inflation. And recently some utility companies, particularly in the telecom sector, have started increasing their prices by the measure of inflation, plus a bit, it has to be said. I'm just interested, if this was to spread more widely, there's clearly the potential for a feedback loop. And I'm just wondering if this is something that you would be concerned about.
What you might be talking about is sort of one instance of a slightly more general phenomenon at the moment, that the corporate sector as a whole does feel like it has a little more pricing power than it did before the pandemic. Now, why that is the case, I think there's a lot of debate about that. But our sense from the contacts of our agency network around the country is that for the first time in quite a while, businesses feel that not only are they seeing rises in costs, but also that they feel able to pass on those rises in costs. Now, our sense too, although you don't see it in the data yet, is that the rise in energy prices that we're seeing, and we're talking about all afternoon, is going to choke off consumer demand and choke off consumer demand reasonably quickly. And that will almost certainly lead to some response by consumers to all those non-essential bits of spending that they can maybe decide to substitute away from in the short run. So it would be maybe an unwise decision for businesses to rely on that pricing power staying the way it is currently.
Thank you, Fergal. Can you pass it over to Nigel first, and then Nigel, can you pass it on to...
I have a question for Paul Lewis, which is about the scope for citizen dissent. So you may remember the poll tax riots, where people refused to pay their poll tax. Last night we went to a meeting where the proposal is that people turn off their direct debits for energy and replace them with standing orders at the pre-increase prices. If people did that en masse, what do you think would happen?
Well, the problem with converting to standing orders is that you won't get the direct debit price, because the energy companies will say, well, you're just paying for the standing order, you're not getting direct debit price. And so they'll put your unit price and your standing charge up. That would be their first reaction. Then, of course, they wouldn't have enough money. And ultimately, they have the power to disconnect people, especially if they have smart meters. It's very easy. They no longer have to stay around them with pliers, as they did when I was young. So, I mean, that's certainly on the only condition to represent citizen dissent. But it is certainly true that if you stop paying bills, then you'll cause a trouble if 100 people do it, they'll just get penalised. If 10 million people do it, it might be different, but that's not going to happen, I would say.
We don't have that number in the audience, do we? Sorry, thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much.
They'll probably pass the law to make it illegal, as they have knocking on when you protest about the environment.
Our friend did actually want to the president for not paying his council tax.
Okay, Karen. Vicky?
Thank you. Yes, this is really, I'm asking a number of different people who presented, including the ONS on this, because, and the MPC, we're not talking only about energy prices, of course, being high, and we don't know what's going to happen there, but food prices, which are likely to stay high for longer and possibly continue to increase because of the problems this year in farming and so on, will be reflected in what happens next year and the availability of crops. So food prices are another element that might make people sort of cut back on other goods that they spend on. So is that sort of filtered into the forecast of consumer spending sufficiently at present? That's the first question. I think the MPC had something in it about consumers. The second thing is that I heard Fergal saying that business optimism is still high. Well, most of the surveys we have seen, including the CBI, suggest the opposite, that they're actually dropping. Maybe there's still some positiveness somewhere, but even the first quarter CBI one was pretty bad, and as far as I've seen recently, it's pretty, it's getting worse in some of the other surveys, so I was wondering whether that is still valid. And then if you're looking at prices and what you can do to them and forecasting them, and we've just heard the Prime Minister saying there are going to be more measures to ease some of the pressures. There's a lot of there's a movement in Europe to look at social tariffs, so really reducing the prices that you pay for your electricity quite considerably. We've done very little of that, and if that were to happen, of course, that would bring inflation down artificially for a while. So all these things are imponderable. So the certainty with which we're putting in inflation forecast.
To respond to your question about the business confidence you said wasn't too bad. Is that coming from your own agents or?
So, I mean, Vicky is right. The CBI survey has come off a little bit, and most other business surveys have come off a little bit, but nothing like the fall in confidence that we've seen from consumer measures. I have to say, it's a big puzzle. That the gap between consumer and business sentiment is the widest we have ever seen it right now, and it may not last. It may be that businesses are seeing sufficient demand for their products, partly because they're in supply chains themselves and their customers can't get enough of what they produce, or they know that it's hard to find the workers they need to fill the jobs that they have, that they haven't yet seen the pinch coming from the consumer sector. I'm sure more consumer-facing firms are already begin to see that, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few months.
Personally, I think there's possibly a response bias there. I think a lot of the businesses that are really having difficulties are so damn busy, they're not responding to surveys. Whereas, no, I feel this is not untrue. Unlike consumers who can't afford things, they've got no less time to respond to surveys. And I do think there's a potential bias there in your data, in the kind of data we're getting. Yes?
Yes, sorry, speaking as a business owner, if I look at the last year, and we're talking about statistics, and statistics one isn't any good, but I think the last year or two we've been so focused on the pandemic and then also thinking about staffing and huge inflation that when I talk to clients and stuff, our focus has been how do I recruit and retain enough people, and though that becomes the sort of the overarching sort of environment you're in, there will come a time, it's a bit like at the moment, I guess, in the housing market where everyone's worried about housing inflation, there will come a time when people sort of, that Wile E. Coyote moment when you go over and go, actually, haven't got enough demand. But while people are still looking backwards thinking, how do I backfill? They'll only really realise that they need to think about the demand side where they suddenly have spare capacity and they've overshot. And unfortunately, that is quite difficult for businesses to adjust to because they're still in, how do I recruit? I think that will change very quickly in the next few months as that sort of consumer chill comes through. And I think the other point that on the pricing thing, I think one of the things that we need to think about is the behavioural and cultural side. Over the last few years, it was very difficult to get price increases through because, you know, it was a very static environment, people knew price points. And similarly, it was quite easy to hold wages down because prices were down. But wages were very difficult to hold down as we had this boom coming through with the pandemic and the equalisation of London versus the regions. So that created instability, and people said, well, he's getting a price increase and she's getting a price increase, why don't I? Or wage increase. And I think on prices, when you're going into clients and you know they've put up prices, they're going to find it much more difficult to argue against a cost increase because they're putting up prices. So if everyone's doing it, it's much more difficult for a buyer to try and hold the line. And so that cultural and behavioural stuff, I'm sure must play too. I have no idea how you would forecast that. But I suspect we're in a bit of a Wile E. Coyote moment with businesses, and that will play out over the next 2 or 3, 4 months. And then the cultural and behavioural stuff, I guess we'll just have to wait until the frost settles down and we get to a new stability, I think.
You have any comment on that?
I agree with all that.
Okay, fine. I think there's something coming from Zoom. Someone's got a question there. So I think we can there is something.
This is from our Zoomers. I do apologise to them because I didn't get the first few questions. Some of the questions are quite technical, so I'll take those to somebody who can possibly understand them.
Okay.
But this one's quite interesting. We've covered the effects of COVID in the Ukraine. What effect has Brexit had in all of this? Oh, a shrug.
This is actually a simpler question than you might think. If you look at the fall in the pound that followed after the Brexit vote, and then you can roll into the actual numbers so it can. Change in inflation then was of the order of 1.4%, as opposed to what the fall in the pound then represented in Broadford.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean.
We published some research by colleagues at LSE last week looking at the impact of Brexit on food. I mean, you would expect Brexit to have an upward impact on inflation because it's, it's simply in that sense, it's simply a supply shock. It's adding to costs of imports and exports. The LSE research suggested it had a fairly significant upward impact on food prices in the region of 5 or 6% since the beginning of 2020. Much smaller and not statistically discernible impact on other prices. So, I mean, it's clearly not the main thing because inflation is high in the US and EU as well. But equally, I think it's clear that it is having some upward impact. And of course, if we decide to enter into a trade war with the EU over Northern Ireland, that will be another factor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I did have one question, but I think we should spare it. And there is a meeting anyway on the measures, isn't there, in July here again in the RSS, and I think I'll leave my question until then, so the ONS can prepare. I might put it in writing prior to that. I want to thank all my speakers this afternoon. I do apologise for the technical matters which have made us all a bit rushed, but it has been very, very interesting, very rewarding, in fact, from my point of view. I think that we have aired quite a few of the things that needed airing. We haven't come to many conclusions, but one of the key things I really want to emphasise, which is what we're about, which is trying to get the public to understand things. And this little piece of research does indicate the importance of that. So we have here representatives from various organisations, and the truth of the matter is that what your role is in dealing with what is an extraordinarily important topic is just not well understood by the public. And if the public don't understand these things, they're not likely to have much faith or belief in them. And that is crucial to avoiding the kind of circumstance of the public's, the poll tax riots and other matters which we all like to avoid. The truth of the matter is, possibly, that the difficulty we're facing, as illustrated by our key speakers at the beginning, could well lead to these circumstances if we don't learn how to deal with it a little better and understand it more. And that's something which I think all of us should give some thought to I thank you for your attention today and look forward to seeing you in our next one, our next event, where we want to look into the question of the changes in gross domestic product which are under consideration and the national accounts. And as with this one, we'd like to not just look at merely what the ONS are doing, which is a lot of work in these areas, but why they're doing it. Is it the right thing to do? How well do we understand it? Thank you for your time, and please keep attention to our next event in November. Thank you. Bye-bye.